Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric. I've got another exciting episode for you guys today because we're doing a continuation of the Dreamcast Didn't Have to Die video. Because I got a lot of comments about this, including the graphical capability of M2 and what Sega could have done against PlayStation 1 and Nintendo 64 back in 1996. And one commenter said, hey, why don't you compare the M2 to the Sega Model 2? That would be fun because they were around the same time. Genius idea, here it is. Before I get too far involved, though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we have a Patreon link down below as well. But the reason this comparison is going to be so much fun is because when we first talked about Sega releasing the M2 from 3DO versus the Dreamcast, Saturn was in the mix. We're removing Saturn and saying that Sega could have released a Model 2 arcade competitor in 1996 when the Model 2 was still in arcades, having near perfect ports on a home console and graphics that are much better than what the Saturn could have put out. First you saw Virtua Fighter 2 on the Model 2, and now you're seeing the intro to Battle Tryst on the Konami M2. They're extremely comparable. The models have about as many polygons. I would actually say that the models on M2 are slightly smoother and less blocky than those on Sega Model 2 with Virtua Fighter 2. But the entire point of this video is we're going to be putting every genre on the 3DO M2 arcade games on the Konami side against Sega Model 2 versions of the same game. And right off the top, on the left we have Virtua Fighter 2, on the right we have Battle Tryst. Now you will see some of the backgrounds on Virtua Fighter 2 are polygonal, where Battle Tryst is using mostly sprites. But as far as the gameplay is concerned, as far as the model geometry is concerned, you'll see the arms on Kika on the right versus Sarah on the left are much more rounded, they're much smoother. On a Virtua Fighter, Sarah's arms are much blockier. It's a higher polygon count on the M2 side because they use the extra polygons for the character models and not the backgrounds, which I think was a very smart move. Because if you take a look at the background here in Virtua Fighter 2, we do have that entire facade and it is made in polygons, but those background layers near the clouds and everything don't look as good. And I will say that I'm allowing this to internally resolve at 640 by 480 because that's what the emulator works with the best. So this is actually getting a little bit of a bump in resolution compared to what it would be when I capture it out at 1920 by 1080. Now going over to Battle Tryst, you will see that the background is a 2D element, not a 3D element, but the way it is done and structured and the way it rotates around it has a pseudo 3D effect. But the background is so much more detailed, you can see more going on, and it's a little bit more visually interesting in my opinion. Now that of course is subjective, but I appreciate the fact that Konami used the polygonal budget on the models because while I don't usually talk about female characters' butts in this game, I would say Kika's looks round. That means there's enough polygons in there to smooth that edge out. And that's what's going on here. They could have done 3D backgrounds on Battle Tryst, but they chose to use that 3D budget for the character models, and I think that's a really smart move because they definitely look better, in my opinion, than Virtua Fighter 2. And that's why we could have had this at home as a console at the same time. But let's move over to something like Dead or Alive. Again, polygonal backgrounds versus the 2D sprites and background layers on M2 from Konami, but they're moving at the same speed, they're the same type of game, and I would say still again, the M2 wins out against the Model 2 ever so slightly because you can see the character models are still a little blockier. This is better than Virtua Fighter 2, but we're getting closer to a match. Let's take a look at a completely different genre. Gangster light gun shooters, where you play as a cop and you shoot the bad guy. I'm pretty sure Konami was just copying what Sega did constantly, because you're going to see here in Virtua Fighter 2, we're going to go into a subway system. Now it's bright, it's cheery, it's well lit, there's no blood anywhere whatsoever, and when we go over to Total Vice, you're going to see that completely changes tonally. But there's so many similarities in the game structure, I do think Konami was just straight up copying them. Because when you go over to Total Vice, it's the same game except way darker and more violent. But when I say it's the same game, it's also doing the same thing graphically. I think this game looks as good as what Model 2 was doing with Virtual Cop 2, and I so much more prefer the genre of that more violent shooter. I get that subjective, but as we put it here side by side in the train station, the 3DO M2 is not doing anything that the Model 2 couldn't do and vice versa. And that's what I mean when I say if Sega had released the M2 in 1996, they could have had Model 2 level graphics in the living room for $300 because that's how much the hardware was designed to sell for. Model 2 in arcades was thousands upon thousands of dollars. This graphical chip on the 3DO M2 was developed by 10 guys in an office in California, where the Sega Model 2 GPU was developed by Martin Marietta, who would go on to become Lockheed Martin, and they developed fighter jets for the military, so to say their team was probably a little bit bigger would be an understatement. But I love how every single element in this grocery store in Total Vice has interactivity involved in it. There's so much going on, there's so much charm, it is a fun place to be. Now if we go over to Virtual Cop 2 in this jewelry store, outside of that purple color and shingles inside, don't know from a design perspective what they were going for. I would say that while this has a higher resolution, and that's down to the emulator, I don't have all these games as original boards, but I will say it right now, Total Vice looks much better than Virtual Cop 2. But I am not biased. I love both 3DO M2 and the Sega Model 2, because we move over to the horror light gun shooting genre and put House of the Dead up against Evil Knight. House of the Dead cleans the floor with Evil Knight. I love both games equally from a gameplay perspective, but this game looks much better. Now you do need to remember though that the Sega Model 2 is not one arcade board, it's actually 3 revisions, and House of the Dead runs on the last and most powerful revision compared to the 3DO M2, which was just an arcade board that had 1 revision. It never got tweaked. And now I think both of these games are quite excellent, and I think both of them are worth playing. This is a situation in which I do think the 3DO M2 hardware could have handled House of the Dead and much better than the Sega Saturn, where we're going to see a little bit of inferiority come in with the M2, and that's why when I said Total Vice looks better than Virtual Cop 2, I wanted to follow up with a comparison where I think Model 2 looks better than M2, and this whole M2 Model 2 thing is getting as confusing to me as I'm sure it is to you. Side by side, you can tell that House of the Dead is much more detailed. The textures are stronger, the character models have more polygons, but Evil Knight is no slouch. We have all that destructibility in the character models. Now you may notice that there is some breakup of the polygons on the walls. There's a little bit of a jitter. That is not something that the M2 has to do. And this is down to a mathematical error in the software development kit that Konami made to make that happen. But again, when I said I think Konami was copying Sega, here we go again. We had a subway in Total Vice, now we have a dining room in Evil Knight versus House of the Dead. It is so humorous how close these games really are to each other. But like I said, in this instance, House of the Dead wins graphically, but imagine House of the Dead 2 on the Sega M2 if they released that console in 1996. This is a hell of a lot better than what the Saturn version could have done, and we could have had it in our home. But moving on to the shmup genre, I said we're going to talk about every genre on the M2 arcade board. We have my favorite game on the system, Tobey Polystars. I love this shmup, it's cute, it's colorful. Now this runs on a cut down M2 spec. It's 8 megabytes, not 16 megabytes compared to all the other games, so this may have some graphical inferiority, but it still looks really great, it still looks really smooth. And what game are we going to put it up against? Well, that is going to be the following: Zero Gunner from Psycho on the Model 2. This is running slightly faster, but as far as the genres are concerned, they're very similar shmups. I'm even putting them across water. You could have 100% ported Zero Gunner to the 3DO M2 in a home console environment, and it probably would have looked near as good as to what we're looking at right now. As we put them side by side, you will see, again, just weird comparisons. I think this one is just accidental. There's a train station in Chicago on the left in Zero Gunner, and then there's train tracks on the right in Tobey Polystars. But both of these games look better than anything that was on home consoles in 1996. And if you took Zero Gunner on the left and ported it to the 3DO M2 hardware, you could have had it running in living rooms at the same time that the Sega Saturn and PlayStation 1 were on the market. And that's what I mean when I say Sega could have had the most powerful console, and they were going to be able to port Model 2 games home that were perfect or near perfect. We even get a sports comparison, and that's how similar these platforms really are, and Konami was basically, I think, trying to emulate Sega the whole way, because right now we have Virtual Striker. I don't like soccer. I don't like soccer games. I've never played soccer. I have nothing against soccer. I'm just not a big sports fan in general. Baseball is probably the only sport that I would, follow on any regular basis, and even that's kind of a misnomer. But if we move over to Heat of 1198 on the 3DO M2 arcade hardware, it's got a different look to it, but I think it looks as good. These games to me are interchangeable. That means you could have had this on the home market with Model 2 power in 1996 for $300. Because don't forget, when I say these are comparable graphically, they are not comparable price-wise. A new Sega Model 2 arcade board and cabinet, and of course the cabinet price jacks it up, was thousands upon thousands of dollars, but the base hardware was still a couple $1,000s for a PCB back then. If we take something like the 3DO M2, you could have sold that for $300 at home all day long and had almost near to perfect, if not perfect, Model 2 conversions in the living room. How crazy is that? Because Virtual Striker compared to Heat of 11, I think Heat of 11 looks slightly better. And this is what I'm talking about when I say the Dreamcast didn't have to die. Had Sega bought the 3DO M2 spec hardware and released it in 1996, you would have been getting perfect Model 2 ports home. Something like the final revision of Model 2 with House of the Dead would have had to have a few graphical downgrades, but if you think about what the Sega Saturn version looks like, it would have been a hell of a lot better to have M2 at home with Sega than getting canceled by Panasonic. Leave me a comment down below, tell me what you think. I know you guys have been enjoying these comparison videos. Hit like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time that I want to talk more about the 3DO M2. Bye-bye.